Hello, everyone. It's your host, Amanda Eke, and I have some amazing news. Starting this fall, The Poet Speaks is coming to your TV screens. Yes, that's right. After 8 amazing seasons as a podcast, The Poet Speaks with Amanda Eke is now a TV show, airing on the Archaeology Channel's new streaming service, Heritage. Everyone get ready for a visual feast of spoken word performances and deep dives into the minds of poets from all over the world. Now, something extraordinary is coming, and you won't want to miss a single moment. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Poet Speaks podcast. Now, our next guest body of work deals with place, ecology, memory, and cultural reckoning. She's published 5 celebrated poetry collections. Her book, Work in Days, was one of the New York Times best poetry books of 2016. 2024 to 2025, she will serve as a poet laureate of El Cerrito, California. Everyone, welcome to the Poet Speaks podcast. Tess Taylor. Tess, how are you?
I am so happy to be here. Thank you, Amanda.
Absolutely. So tell us a bit, where are you at currently right now in the world? We love to find out where our guests, where we're talking to them from, how far away we are in a digital space. So where are you at currently in the world right now?
I am sitting in my living room in a little bungalow in El Cerrito, California. That's the town I grew up in. I left. I lived in Boston and Brooklyn. I did the writer thing on the East Coast for a while. And then I ended up back in the little town I grew up in. It is a suburb that is between Richmond, California and Berkeley, California. And in some ways, you could just think it was a boring little suburb. But I actually think there's a lot of fascinating stuff about it. It's the endpoint on a lot of people's migration routes. It's been the most diverse school district in the country since the 1980s. I grew up and went to public school here. And one of the cool things about coming back and getting to be the poet laureate is I'm going back into the schools that I attended and just looking at them a few years later down the road, thinking about all of the places and stories that converge here. I really love that. Another thing that's cool about the town of El Cerrito is that the photographer Dorothea Lange, who photographed the Great Depression and photographed a lot of people in shelterlessness and migrancy, she actually had a note to herself to do a photo essay on El Cerrito in the 1940s. She thought it was a fascinating place because, again, it was getting built up really fast. People were coming together to work in the shipyards. Richmond had the first desegregated workplace in America in the 1940s. And at the same time, people who lived in El Cerrito, Japanese Americans, were getting taken away for Japanese internment. So it's been a place of like fracture and paradox and possibility. And it's also very beautiful. It's literally right across the Golden Gate. Yeah. You can stand at the edge, stand in the El Cerrito BART station, and you're looking straight into the mouth of the Golden Gate, watching the fog come in or go out every day. So I don't know. It's like, it's an interesting thing to try to describe your home. I love that that's your first question.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things too, you know, because I actually grew up in Sacramento, California. I don't know if you're familiar with NorCal Unite, but I grew up in Sacramento and I went to school for undergrad at UC Davis. Actually, my brothers went to school, UC Berkeley, but very familiar with that area. I'm curious, you know, because already you have such a celebrated career, but you kind of think about your life kind of plays out like a beautiful novel too, going back to your hometown, then become the poet laureate. I mean, you know, I kind of want to hit on that a little bit. You know, I think everyone, they always want to leave their hometown. And then, you know, some people find their way back. How do you how do you feel about that? You know, some people I know in my experience, some people that it's their biggest fear to go back to where they started from. Other people, they love the idea of going back. How have you kind of reckoned, like you said, home is an interesting place. How have you reckoned with that idea of home?
Well, I feel so lucky that I have a place that's this lovely that I could go back to. I mean, a lot of our lives, a lot of the stories of this century are about exile and about people being far from places, you know, and we all have different homelands that, you know, are further away from us. And just even in a funny way, my father's family was very deeply in Virginia for so long. And my mother's family was very deeply in New England. And in some ways, I almost felt like our generation, their generation of coming to California, that even that was like a funny diaspora from like these settled places where
Yeah.
even in that way, they had been kind of like ingrained in a place and a culture. And my parents, both of them had kind of distinct ways of being that were a little bit incompatible, almost like this northern New Englander who was like salty and stony and like she was a little flinty and she had all of these like makerly cottagey ways. And my dad was from this Virginia family that had other ways. And I thought a lot about the fact that we have these trade routes in our bodies that are like the stories of where we come from and the stories of the funny expressions our parents use. And I was always really interested in dialect words and the sort of the histories that we carry with us. And I think that's what I love in literature too. Like I love those stories that make me aware of like just the compassion that we have for one another's like long trade routes that are inside each other's bodies, or like the unexpected convergences of stories that we feel. That's not the answer of how I come back to El Cerrito, though. The truth is, I did not want to come back here. I was just too close to school, and I just didn't. I thought I was up and out. I was in Boston and Brooklyn, and I thought I was going to live on the Eastern Seaboard. And it was really getting to be just a little older, getting partnered, expecting my first child. And I remember this day where I drank too much coffee running around New York on an empty stomach. And I really agitated my pregnancy. And I was walking up like a fifth floor walk up, and I was just exhausted. And I thought, I don't want to do this. I could if I had to, but I don't want to. And I suddenly just thought about like these bungalows and these lemon trees. I thought about this neighborhood that was this kind of homely, scrappy, working class neighborhood that I'd grown up in. And I came back here and it's the Bay and it's changed. It's like so expensive to live here. Really, the internet economy really transformed a lot of the things that I loved. When I grew up here, there wasn't an internet. So it was really like there was the distinctness to this place, this Berkeley place, as opposed to other places. You weren't able to get, to communicate as quickly across all these boundaries and borders. And in one of my poems, I said that California felt like a crumbling outpost. And like we were just like the furthest edge of something, like of the imagination of America, that we were like this kind of sun-baked, crumbling, scrappy place that was tacked on to America at the last minute, for gold. But now the internet is here and we're this engine of this crazy economy and this crazy like projection of images, and people work, selling ads for Facebook and they work selling ads for Twitter, and the whole kind of idea that this is now the center of selling images is like, so it's really different in some ways. Another thing about coming back is I think actually some of the stuff that I write about and thought about a lot, about the fractures I felt in the public school system, about this like earthquake zone that we live on, about like precariousness. California feels only more precarious to me. It feels, the problems around income inequality and housing shortages and climate catastrophe are all they feel so intensified, even from things that were here decades ago when I was growing up. And, going back into the public schools that I grew up attending, I'm aware that some of the issues have maybe resolved themselves and some of them haven't. And it's just fascinating to see the movement of a life like that.
That's an interesting perspective to have. And it really touches on, like I read in your, reading your bio, a lot of your work, you say it deals with memory and cultural reckoning, especially kind of your explanation of California from what it was to what it is now. That's a very fascinating perspective. I'm kind of curious though, for you, I mean, you've had a very successful career in poetry and writing. I mean, what is the the, I think the word memory, that's such that's very specific to each person, but it's also a very vague term. Word, when you think about the word memory, what does that mean to you from when you started your career writing to now? And then also tell us, where did this, well, first off, let me say this. Tell us, where did poetry find you? Just talking to you alone right now, you're a very deep thinker. I can tell you're very introspective even before we even started the interview. I can just tell by the way you're forming your thoughts, your sentences, you're very introspective. When did writing even find you? Was it in California as a little girl growing up, or did it find you somewhere along your path as you moved across places, across the states? Where did poetry first and foremost find you?
I love that you asked that question. I have an uncle that's a blues musician. And when you ask him why he's a blues musician, he said, I didn't choose the blues chose me. Which I just think is good. It's a good answer. And I mean, one of the stories that I tell is that I was in college and I had auditioned for the lead in a play from the visiting playwright, who is also the visiting poet. And the play was in verse. And I delivered the lead, and the visiting playwright poet said, why don't you show up for my class? And so I did, and my heart was kind of a flutter. And then the poet, his name was Glenn Maxwell. He said, some of you are going to be using these skills to write advertising copy, or maybe you'll become a lawyer. And that's a really good way to use language, but maybe some of you will become poets. Mm. And I remember feeling incredibly stubborn that the person who should become a poet would be me. Mm. The funny thing is, he was a great teacher. And in fact, a number of us have become poets from that class, like working writers. There was something sort of magical about the early moments of this training that we started to get together. I trained a lot to be a musician as a young person. I sang. I was in a choir that was allowed to sing children's parts in the San Francisco Opera. Wow. So I was doing like a high level training. I don't know if I exactly wanted to be an opera singer. I knew that I loved like this intense level of practice, and I loved like tinkering, and I loved all the possibilities of art making. Like I loved practice. That was kind of magical to me. But at a certain point, somehow I didn't see the path forward. I mean, this wasn't like nobody said, don't be a singer. It wasn't like that. It was just like one day I was tired of that, and I took up smoking and singing jazz. Mm. And then I started writing poems. And early on, one of the best important sensations to me was that poems could be musical, that they had the quality of language distilled into music. So one of the examples I like to give of that is if you say, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. You've basically said a logistical sentence. It rhymes a little bit, but it's like, I've got to go home. But if you say, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. That repetition right there gets you in the presence of something else. And you're in the presence of dealing with death, really. It feels like death has showed up in the poem. And it's really in the magic of the echo that something, some other meaning is being transacted. Mm. And the idea that you're doing some music with your words that is pulling against and with the surface of meaning, that the music of language is working with the surface of language to create this sensation of being inside something like that reverberates. Mm. I think was the first of the magics. And that was like the first kind of spell casting part of the poem making. It was kind of like getting to be a magical musical composer for the breath, you know? And that was like one of the gateway drugs. And then ever since then, there've been so many more gateway drugs. I'm like 25 years in, keep going. So.
Absolutely. Tell me a bit about like you said, that magic making. How was that magic making from the start of your career to where it is now? I mean, what is that kind of trajectory for you felt and looked like? Like when you began, did you ever see that you would have, New York Times Best Poetry Book of 2016, become the Poet Laureate of your hometown? I mean, all these celebrated works. What has really changed from beginning till now for you in terms of maybe your growth? Like you said, memory and cultural reckoning is something you really take note of. What has been your own cultural reckoning in your own lineage and path of life?
Oh, wow. Yeah, you asked a great question earlier about memory.
So memory, like I said, memory making, that is such a vague term, but it's very specific to each person at the same time, right? Memory, what does memory mean to you from the beginning of when you started 25 years ago, as you said, to now in your career? What does the kind of cultural reckoning and what does memory mean in terms of your writing and your poetry from now until today? What does that term even mean for you now?
It's funny when you say the word memory and you ask me to talk about memory, I immediately think of that Lucille Clifton poem that says, why some people be mad at me sometimes. And it's a very short poem. Why some people be mad at me sometimes. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. And I just love about each of us that we all carry within us something that's defiant to received history. I'm sure that we do. I'm sure that each of us has this moment when we're told it's a certain way and we discover that's not so.
Yes.
We discover that there's something else we need to know. And I think that's the moment when we confront the ghosts of our family, the ghosts of our culture, the ghosts of our country, really. And what's really interesting and important about poetry is that poetry, especially the lyric, is a place to have conversations that cannot really be transacted by other medium.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I could tell you, did you send the letter on Tuesday? And you could say yes. We would not be speaking in a poem. Mm-hmm. But if it is at the level where we have to address the ghosts of our family, the ghosts of our culture, or the ghosts of our country, we begin to be transacting speech that needs to take place at the level of poetry. And that speech might take place in a play, but the play would be delivering monologues that would essentially be poems, When you are addressing an inanimate or something that can't speak back, but you need to reckon with it, that is like an essentially poetic form of address right there. And so when I realized that poetry was a vessel for having these arguments, which are essentially about trying to get right with the broken places in our history and ourselves and our families and our country, that was something that woke me up a great deal. And so that's one thing. It's a place for recovering things that have been left out or to the side. And I think all of my books so far have a way of doing some kind of digging or excavation with things that have been left out or left to the side or don't sit right. And, I was talking about all of this kind of feeling of returning to California. And I'll just say it like the most gracious way I can. I attended a very imperfectly desegregated school district. I mean, that is a gracious way of saying, like, I grew up in the presence of like gross inequities and violences that were happening around me. And I didn't have the language to understand what they were or what was happening or exactly why or how. And I'm not even sure we ever do. But I think that sense that we need to explain the places from which we came, or that we want to reach out and look into the things that we didn't understand before and that we need to understand. And poetry is just such a powerful way of having tools for giving voice. So I think that's kind of what I mean by memory and reckoning.
For sure, for sure. But something that you said that I really loved, it was this idea that memory is, what did you say? You had said, you basically made note that memory is the poem you had forementioned. People want you to remember things the way they remembered it, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. This idea that we are our own perspective on the world and our own history and our own culture is what really ingrains itself in us to create those memories. No, I love that. I love that. So let's move on a bit right now. Let's talk about one of your widely known works, Work in Days, which was one of New York Times best poetry books of 2016. Tell me a little bit about, to receive an honor like that. I mean, tell me kind of what, a lot of people that listen to this show always ask the poet how they even began a career in writing. And I think so many people want to write poetry. So many people write poetry. A lot of people don't see it as a career, right? For a numerous myriad of reasons, money making, economic, cultural, right? Being an artist is not an easy life. Tell us like a little bit about, to receive such an honor was a very special piece, I'm sure, to you. What does that, looking back in 2016 to even now, what is that now kind of when you look back on, I'm sure what was a wild ride for that release? What does it mean now? And what does it, what does it feel like still?
Well, that book, Work in Days, was a really special book. It came out of a really special time. I mentioned that I'd been kind of scrapping it together in Brooklyn. I worked as a waitress in a funeral parlor I worked as a waitress in a restaurant that had been a funeral parlor. I wrote PR on the side. I wrote jacket copy for books. I taught a little bit, and I was hustling the hustle. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us do in this crazy gig economy, this kind of thankless, crazy gig economy that is super late capitalism, or whatever we're going to call it right now. And I received for the first time, a major fellowship, which was this fellowship to go live at the Amy Clampett House in Western Massachusetts. It's way out in Lenox. It's right by where Tanglewood is. And they usually give 6 months fellowships. And for some reason, it was a complicated year. They gave me the whole year to sit in this house of this poet who also had a hard life, but she had left. She'd, won a MacArthur and left her house for other poets to write in. And this is a gift, right? These little oases that happen. So for an entire year, I had housing and a really good stipend. And in fact, I knew I'd have more time on my hands than I could really productively use. because I've always been a gardener, and gardening is one of the things that I do as a kind of like practice. I called them to see if there'd be any community gardens up there. And they were like, well, it's nice that you want to come to this rural area, but we don't have community gardens. We have farms. Would you like to work on a farm? And so I said, okay. And I found a 3-acre community supported agriculture farm that was irrigated by the Green River that served a bunch of restaurants and 88 families vegetables the summer. And I called them and they were like, well, it's January. You can show up in like March or April as soon as the earth melts, and then there'll be work to do. And I signed on. And it was crazy because, you know, at first there wasn't any work to do because it was frozen. Yeah. And then the very first work was literally bending down, you know, old school style and pulling stones out of the field. And then, you know, the next work was coddling these little starts inside this greenhouse, and they literally sat on electric blankets. They were in a greenhouse with plugged in electric blankets to warm them up, to get them ready to go. And then just as the leaves started coming out, that same week that the leaves come out, you put the first lettuces in the ground. And there was such this intense worry then, you know, what if there's one more storm, or what if it's suddenly too hot? Like, I felt so intensely aware of the fragility of the enterprise of farming, which is the enterprise of getting us food. And so it was this year that I had off of normal hustle and to do like deep thinking and deep work. And I want to say that I really, you know, you feel sort of guilty or something, like everybody else is out doing their hustle and I have this gift of a year. But it was a year where I could be really watchful, sort of on behalf of big questions, on behalf of the culture. And I still love that book. And I haven't had that kind of time since then. By the end of the year, I was becoming a parent. And, you know, then I went back to like, again, the juggling the gig economies of late capitalism and childcare and, you know, but I would just say the fact that I was given that time and that it was honored was a huge deal. And it made me really understand the need for deep space, that like where there can be spaces for artists to have that time to go deep, I would love for every maker in America to be able to apply for like long fellowships, to be able to just really go think more unconstrainedly.
You know, you make such a great point, Tess. That idea of I was doing a panel the other day for a mental health show, and we had talked about this idea of just being able to not create, not, you know, produce. A lot of us feel a genuine guilt when you just sit back and maybe not do and produce, right? Because of, like you had mentioned, capitalism, right? The day-to-day grind. It's one of those things, yeah, that kind of idea, to give yourself that sacred time to really just be, right? Like I know even people, let's say even they pay for a holiday and vacation, they feel guilty about just sleeping all day. Can you imagine that? You feel guilty after you just paid for flights and hotels to go all the way across the world, right? And it's this kind of idea, we feel this kind of enmeshed need to just kind of create and produce. And it's one of those things, like you said, yeah, if we could just really give that to every single human being, every soul on this earth, the opportunity to just be, right? Talk a little bit about how important do you think that that concept is, though, to especially to someone that's an artist, or even just for just all of people? How important is it to just kind of just be, like you said, that space, that's something you clearly look back on fondly, that time that you were given to just create, or just really just stand still and just be a part?
you bring up such a great point about how are we supposed to value rest in this culture.
Mm.
And I actually have this project right now about reading books about rest. And one of the people who's writing about rest is this woman, Jenny Odell, who has a book about how to do nothing. There's another woman named Trisha Hersey, who she's written this book about the ministry of napping. Mm. And she realized that she felt like she had to produce every moment, and that she was sort of like working herself into sort of a deep exhaustion, and that she would find that rest, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, was this way of actually like honoring herself, her ancestors, her spiritual well-being, and a way of like fighting back against this notion that we have to like monetize every minute. Another book is called Rest by Alex Sujung Kim Pang. And the thing that's amazing in it is that he actually kind of quantifies that some of the people who are able to be the most creative and productive, we focus on their productivity. But if you look at their lives, they also have patterns that allow more rest. Mm. And I talked to him recently, and he was like, all work is creative work. You know, nursing is creative work. Teaching is creative work. Anything that requires firefighting is creative work. And that anything that requires human discernment is something that should be done with a balance of resting. And what would it be like if we really took it seriously, that we were going to be better off, all of us, healthier, happier, living longer, but also more in touch with our creative beings if we just gave ourselves more rest. And he's the kind of guy, this is a guy who gets up at 5 a.m. to write. Mm. But he takes 20-minute naps after lunch every day, which I just thought, what is it that I could give myself? You know, what is it that each of us could give ourselves in the middle of this crazy life that we're all doing with all of this hustle? Is there a way to create boundaries where there's space for reverie, there's space for dreaming, and honestly, there's space for naps?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I love that. I love that phrase, though. I love that all work is some sort of creative work. I really do. I liken myself to that phrase, even just, I would say, I mean, even just the arrangement of how you, arrange your toothpaste with your toothbrush in the morning, or how you even decide to wash your body in the morning. I mean, those are all just creative works of the spirit and soul. I do believe, at least. Now you arrange your dinner plate. No, I love that. I'm going to go ahead.
Taking delight in those things, right? Like having time to have pleasure in your body, in life, making the space for the joy that is available to you is, I mean, Ross Gay calls it a defiant act, right? It is so important. And that's like this place where we renew ourselves and we get ready to look at all of the difficult things, you know, and to live into some of these, really painful challenges that come our way every day.
1000%. Absolutely. Finding the pleasure in the docile and the mundane. Absolutely. I love that. Moving on a bit. I mean, Tess, has been such a great interview thus far. I want to talk about, this is a very interesting spic I found. So you're developing the stage play of American photographer Dorothea Lange. Tell us a little bit about what that project will be looking like, and what are you looking forward to with that, and how this even kind of conceived together?
So we talked about El Cerrito. We talked about how I didn't think I could live here again. I thought I was too cool for this place and I wanted to be gone.
Yeah.
And when I came back, I had a small child. And the thing that you can do with a small child is you can walk around the block with the child on your chest or in the stroller again and again, hoping that they will go to sleep or just soothing them down. So I'm walking by the bungalows of my childhood that I had left a long time before. I'm thinking, in what way can I make something of this experience? And then I realized through a little bit of research that Dorothea Lange had photographed this town of bungalows in the, in the late 30s and early 40s. And I got really intrigued, like, what did she see here?
Yeah.
And at the same time, you're a Californian, that the kind of visual stuff that she documented in the 30s and 40s of people living in tents in extremely fragile and precarious housing, that is something that is part of our visual landscape everywhere in California. And that the feeling of living in the presence of unsheltered people or people with marginal shelter has become endemic in these California cities. And I just kept thinking, wasn't Dorothea Lange just here photographing this very problem? And didn't it seem to go away or change? And why are we living in the presence of, she's the person who's taught me something about what it is to look at this situation with care and with dignity. And I got fascinated. I went and looked at her notebooks. I ended up driving all the places she'd driven in California in the 30s and 40s. I ended up writing her letters from the present. And her notebooks have these cool staccato, interesting, fabulous, like pop, pop, pop things that she gathered alongside of the road, like how much gas cost, how much beans cost, all that stuff about getting by. She was a documentarian of the art of getting by. And she also had these haunting phrases, like people would say things to her like, this country's a hard country. When you die, you're dead. That's all. Mm. And I just thought, yeah, this country is a hard country, and it ended up being this collage poem of all these voices, my voice to Dorothea Lange, Dorothea Lange's notebook voice, all the voices on the side of the road, and less like an exact theater play and more like this kind of symphony of voices. And the poem is like a collage of voices that all talk almost past each other in this. You have to believe me. I think it builds. I mean, I think it's kind of musical. And somebody said, what would it be like if you actually had the voices speaking, like if you made it into a play? And this idea grew. A wonderful director approached me. I'm working with a projectionist who is creating this kind of moving interactive backdrop of projected Lange images. So it's a little bit like a surrounding immersive experience. Wow. And you'll sit there and it will be like Lange and the poet and the people on the side of the road are calling out to you. And meanwhile, her images are going by. And, it's going to be the 90th anniversary of the Works Progress Administration, which was the government organization that funded her work, and the 130th anniversary of her birth. And my hope is that a consortium of California museums is going to come together and do this sort of re-engagement of Lange. And I guess the question is, here's a woman that photographed shelterlessness, climate change, climate migration, and all of those issues are with us today. Yeah. What can she teach us? What can we learn about ourselves by re-engaging her? And also, I guess biggest question is like, what could art do to be part of the repair? She was on a government-sponsored journey that had to do with all kinds of gestures to buttress America, to build bridges, to build high schools, to build oral histories, to let Zora Neale Hurston and Ralph Ellison have a paycheck while they did amazing work on behalf of our country. And she was part of that. And are we at a different moment where we need to talk about how can art be part of the conversations towards repair that we need to be having, like yesterday, now, tomorrow? And so to me, I think part of getting her voice out there and her images out there is to help us ask ourselves now, what should we do?
Absolutely. No, it's very, that sounds like a very passion project, and wishing you all the best. Do you have a tentative year in which you hope to see that come to life?
Fall of 2025.
Awesome. All right. We'll definitely be looking forward to that. The amazing legacy of Lange. All right. Well, Tess, this has been such a great conversation. And for folks that are wondering, again, check out all of Tess's amazing work. Now, Tess, before we go, we have one final question for you on the Poet Speaks podcast. Tell me, why do you need to get your words out?
Because they feel itchy if I don't. They actually like hurt on the inside of my brain. I will wake up and I'll be like, that is like itching. It feels like having like a little do you know when you listen to like you get like an earworm? Like a little bit of song and it's just stuck in your head.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it starts for me. And in a way, nobody cares if you write a poem or not. Like you could just take a break from writing a poem. but I don't know. I think you're suddenly in the presence of this thing inside you that wants to be heard. And then you start to say yes and you give it space. And literally though, like I will feel like I have something knocking around and I just have to get it down and get it out. And then that first moment when I get it out onto paper, I really don't care if it becomes a great poem or not. I just had an itchy feeling of lots of language in the on this side underneath my eyebrow or something. And it's like, I got to drain that.
All right, y'all. She had to scratch her itch. That's what it is. That's why she must get her words out. All right. Thank you so much, Tess. Now, before we end though, do tell us, where can folks check out all of your amazing work? Any links for websites, social media, and just tell us what is coming up next for you for folks to look into for 2024.
Okay. Well, I'm at Tessathon on Instagram. I would love to connect with you there. I'm a little bit on Facebook. I am no longer much into X, and I haven't dabbled in the other things yet. So I like to keep it like a little rosy and positive on Instagram. It does not, that is like the place that I probably hang out the most. I just edited a book of contemporary gardening poems for an era of climate change. It's called Leaning Toward Light, Poems for Gardens and the Hands That Tend Them. If you are a gardener, if you love the way microbes and pollinators and flowers conspire to make our lives more beautiful, if you believe in the radical abundance that plants can give, this might be a book for you. If your mama is that person, it might be a book for her. And I just finished up a big tour. So this summer, I'm laying low, working on new poems. But I'll be out again in the world in the fall. And I would love to meet you. And I'm really happy to be able to talk to fellow writers over this podcast medium.
Absolutely. Now, Tess, we'd love to meet you as well. And everyone, check out all of Tess's amazing work. We'll have her links in the description. No matter what platform you're listening to this amazing podcast, her links will be in the description box down below. All right, Tess, we're so honored, privileged, and thankful that you were able to grace us, your amazing presence and words, and have this amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Poet Speaks podcast, Tess.
Amanda, it was totally, the joy was mine. Thank you so much for this afternoon.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, again, check out all of Tess's amazing work and check out the Poet Speaks podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. All right, bye-bye, everyone.